Bitcoin traders, what's going on? Thanks for joining me for the show. Going to be looking at Bitcoin Cash, BCH on that ticker. Haven't really covered it since a lot of this big upside explosive move that we saw. So going to be talking about this pullback and now running into these exponential moving averages. So got a lot of great things to talk about with Bitcoin Cash, upside targets, downside targets for support, likely scenarios and things we can think of that happen next. So if you do like this type of content and are a fan of Bitcoin Cash, make sure to hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so you can stay updated on all future videos like this. So yeah, I guess just since we started talking about it first, that really need to talk about how this explosive move really broke through these exponential moving averages. So after having a huge gap all this way down, and especially after bottoming down of June and July of last year, now with about a year of sideways trading, finally found an explosive move that we're now seeing a pullback to. And right now, why we are actually looking at still a bullish scenario based on a technical setup and pattern. And that's kind of despite the rest of the crypto space, which obviously is pulling back as well. So of course, we're going to see Bitcoin Cash pulling back. And so we know that big explosive moves like this without significant substantiation typically always do end up pulling back and having a big retracement, since what we find a lot in crypto is huge pump and then a slow, long drawback and taper down, because there's nothing able to continue this type of buying that would be able to maintain this type of excitement and euphoria without seeing a decrease in buying pressure, which does lead to that selling and the start of a big, major, longer-term sell-off. So because we always see this in crypto, it's to be expected, and we even talked about it in the last Bitcoin Cash video. But so now the big target for bulls right now is going to be eyeing the downside support, which is right where the 50 period and also this 26 period exponential moving average are crossing actually. So we do have a pretty tight range, but over it does sit right around the 180 level. So if we do draw a horizontal price line pretty much right at 180, excuse me, then this is extremely significant for multiple reasons too, especially because zooming out over here on the left, big point of support before ultimately breaking and finding our bottom down in June and July of last year. So definitely a year's worth of nice accumulation, which did allow these longer term weekly exponential moving averages to start getting tight and eventually finally finding a little bit of bullish confirmation now, since we do have the 26, like we said, on top of this 50, and now we are finding that big defense. So if we do get a bearish close below that level, that's going to be kind of not necessarily the best sign, but we do still have a lot of downside supports. And of course, we do have a long way to go in order to maintain a higher low, on this pullback. So best case scenario right now is that the 180 holds on this weekly. We are able to confirm this level of support and either establish a support line here that leads to some consolidation, or in that instance as well, bouncing and then retracing this upper channel, upper level of high for a new higher high coming in at 329.71. Now, so additionally, if we zoom out even farther and look at this 180 support line, you can see that right around the COVID timeframe of last year, this was our big support point, then found our rally March COVID pullback and finding this level just below it as a nice level of support, but then ultimately rallying off of there again. So the fact that this was a very big level for a longer term support back then in the 2020 era before we saw our last bull market would be nice to be able to maintain that in order to confirm a little bit of that longer term established level, especially since it was that big support point, even though we didn't really find it as resistance that much. But up overhead on top of that big resistance point that does come in right at 140, which like we talked about in the last video as well, would be an extremely nice support point if in fact we do break. So despite that being a bear sign, if we do break 180, we would still be looking back on a more recent actual previous resistance line, which would be back tested and ideally confirmed as support. Obviously, if that wasn't able to hold, bears would be able to push prices back down, but that's not a likely scenario at this point. So not going to be talking about it in detail other than that. So we do have 180 followed by 140 as downside supports. Realistically, I would expect this zone to be a nice cushion and buffer if we do see prices continuing to wick down in the weekly on this. I would expect longer term prices to be able to establish themselves and stabilize in this overall point. Like we said, though, plenty of support right at 180. So if we do see a little bit of confirmation of some bouncing over the rest of the crypto space, very nice opportunity for the bulls to confirm 180 and actually push prices back up, especially since most other cryptos are starting to get oversold on the longer time frames. All right, so now flipping on over into the daily, looking at the volume pulled up on the bottom. So after all of this massive volume, which we actually were getting peak for volume that we've actually ever seen out of Bitcoin Cash, and especially substantially here, very big sign, but ultimately did taper off. And now we're not actually seeing that much bearish volume come in despite this level of retracement and pullback. But like we said, with such a huge explosive move in such a short time frame, it was to be expected. And that likely means the defense and order book isn't going to be stacked that substantially to the downside, so it's not going to take as much volume to actually push prices back here. Now, if we do pull up technicals, we are still oversold on the daily since we have been here over the last 5 days or so, bottoming out at 24.38. But with that, we actually haven't had too much of a bounce and retracement yet, which is why we're still more or less flatlining. And so from here, that actually is starting to favor a bearish movement a little bit more. But likely in that instance, we would be testing and checking whether or not we can set a higher low compared to this initial flush, which saw a low at 16416. Any potential bull break to the upside would likely get stuck up right around the 220 level, since that would be marked by previous support on this chart, as well as the exponential moving averages pulling back to the downside. We know that this 50-period EMA on the daily was the last big point of support prior to this huge flush. So if we can look where that actually would be as resistance, that would be one of the big resistance points that we would be testing, which still would come in right below that 220 mark. And then in addition to that, we're also looking at a very nice downside trend line that has still been very relevant, providing resistance to the downside. So any potential upside move would likely get stuck up at that level, still below 220. So if we are looking to break to the downside, we would need to maintain that higher low. But if we do see an upside break, then pretty much we're going to expect a lower high coming in below that 220 level before pulling back and then being able to establish that higher low once again. Flipping over to the 2-day chart, same thing, still looks extremely bearish, especially after finding that support that we talked about, then confirming 50 period as resistance on this initial bounce for this overall 2-day chart. So on this 2-day chart too, it's also more apparent how we're looking at a downtrending line of support that has also been extremely relevant and broken. So any potential upside move would be met with the exponential moving average resistance as well as this downside support trend line, which is now going to be flipped into resistance. So if we look at resistance being between 200 and 220, that's going to line up with both downtrend lines of support and resistance that this flag was making prior to the initial flush, which does mean difficulty seeing a rally to the upside. So bears are still definitely in control of this downside move. So overall, my realistic expectations are still, even if we do expect a bounce, we're still likely going to end up rolling back and testing 140, and in between 160 and 140 is going to be a very big buy zone, I think. So personally, downside targets for any new entries and trades would be under consideration from 160 down to 140. So that would be our zone and target that we're going to be looking at. And again, that's not to say that we won't actually see a little bit of a bounce and establishment of a floor on top of that. It's just that for any new longer term entries and trades, this is going to be one of the targets that we look at for any of those longer term entries. But of course, as always, do love knowing any of your entries down in the comment sections below. What we do see right now is that if we actually take a Fibonacci from the level of support, and let's just call it right at the 100 line up to the high of the move just over 329, then the middle point of this zone that we drew out would be the 78.6 coming in at right at 148. So that would be a very nice retracement level to actually see and have targets fill. Upside move between 220 and 200 would sit in line with between 61.8 and also below the 38.2. 38.2 does come in right at 240 or just over at 241. So nonetheless, we would be looking at plenty of resistance points up overhead on any potential bounce. But we also know that the strength of the 78.6 is going to be a lot stronger, especially as support after such a move, than likely we would experience on any sort of a rebound here in this instance. So 78.6 is going to be a really big downside target, and expectation is that unless something drastically changes right now and we see another rally over crypto, likely we are anticipating being able to hit and see fills at that level. All right, well, that actually is going to go ahead and wrap up our show and analysis on Bitcoin Cash BCH on that ticker. Do let me know all of your comments, issues, predictions, disagreements down in the comment sections below. And also, if you haven't done so just yet, do hit that thumbs up, like, and subscribe button if you did enjoy the video today. All right, well, I do appreciate all the continued love and support. As always, it does mean so much. Stay safe, take care, everyone, and I will catch you back in the next video.